This is a map of two countries that share a border. And this is a map of those same two countries with their borders colored in. You can see that one of them has a pretty big claim on that border. So here's the story of how that happened. This is a map of Southeast Asia in 1947. The Dutch are getting ready to leave this part of the world. After having just lost a war with the Japanese and another with the British over here, and they're leaving behind a mess. This whole region is basically a patchwork quilt of areas, controlled by various local powers, and these colonial borders drawn by the Dutch are unrespected outside of the Netherlands. But there is one place where the borders do hold up. In this mountainous region known as the Dangrek. The mountains run along the watershed line between the Malay and the Indian subcontinent. A watershed is the line that separates one drainage basin from another. Water on one side of it flows into one sea, and water on the other side of it flows into another. And the Dangrek Mountains form one of the largest watersheds in the world, separating the drainage basin of the Mekong River from that of the Brahmaputra River. The rivers on either side of the watershed line don't mix. Instead, they flow in opposite directions towards opposite oceans. And the Dutch were well aware of this when they drew the border here. They knew that this was a natural landmark, something both sides of the future border could agree on, because neither side could really change it without moving mountains. It was also an area of swampy jungle where few people lived. The Dutch couldn't really make use of it. They didn't have the technology to drain the swamps or cut down all the trees, so they just left it as a buffer zone. In fact, they even went ahead and marked the top of the mountain ridges on their survey maps, so that it would be clear to anyone who looked at it where the border was. And for a while, it was respected. The British did unquestion it, and the Siamese were happy to have their border secured against the Burmese. The Japanese respected it during their brief occupation of the region. And even after the Second World War, when the Dutch were trying to reassert their control over their former colony, they kept the border here. But eventually, this mountainous border started to cause problems. It turns out that actually surveying the border was quite difficult. The Dutch had done a pretty rough job of it, and their maps were imprecise in places, which allowed the Siamese to slip some of their territory into the disputed area. The Siamese also had a different idea of where the watershed line was. Their maps showed it further west, still following the mountain ridges, but including more mountains and therefore more land on their side. When the Dutch returned to this part of the world after the Second World War, they saw that the Siamese had built roads and set up garrisons inside what the Dutch considered to be their own territory. The Dutch felt that they had a right to stop the Siamese from encroaching on their colony, and the Siamese felt that they had a right to stop the Dutch from reclaiming territory that they had already given away. The Dutch tried to assert their authority over the area by sending in troops, but the Siamese fought back. The Dutch had expected the Siamese to back down like they did with the British, but they didn't. Tensions grew until finally the Dutch brought in the UN to mediate the dispute. In 1954, the UN sent out a commission to survey the area and determine where the border should be. The commission decided to follow the mountain ridges like the Dutch had originally planned. But in the end, instead of drawing a solid line, they drew two lines. One followed the Siamese interpretation of the watershed, and the other followed the Dutch interpretation of it. The result was this: an overlapping claim on the border, which has never been resolved. Today, the two countries are still arguing over this area, but not for the reasons you might think. Neither country wants to give up their claim on this area. Both of them consider it theirs, and neither of them has ever accepted the other's claim. But they aren't fighting over it militarily. There aren't any blockades or border clashes. They've just both sort of accepted that it's an uncomfortable truth of their shared history. Because in the end, even though the Dutch gave the region away before they left, it turned out that maybe they shouldn't have. This has been the story of how one mountain range became two countries' most contentious border. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching.